Well, guess what? He's still risen. He's still risen. 2 weeks ago, we talked about the risen Lord. And we were celebrating that because it's a reality that we live within. And my fear is that we save Easter for once a year. And so what I want us to be is a term that I've heard over and over again by other preachers. And can we hit these lights right up there? Because I'm old and can't see real well. Oh, thank you. And let there be light. And there's this phrase that I've heard, and I like using it, and that phrase is being Easter people. And I want us to be, I want to be an Easter people. I want to be a guy that lives every single day, every single moment, all of everything is defined by the fact that Jesus is no longer in the tomb. I want to be an Easter guy, and I want to worship with Easter people because I believe with all of my heart that is the single most powerful, the defining factor of our relationship with Him. It is the culminating reality of the plan that God set into motion the moment humanity came into His mind. The moment that we were conceived in the holy mind of the universe, of the God of the universe, the plan to redeem us was set into motion, and the resurrection of Jesus is the culmination of that, and it ought to be the most exciting thing that we've ever heard or thought of, and we ought to be people who can't wait to tell the story. Because the story keeps on changing. And it doesn't keep on changing like we think of stories that keep on changing, like all the narratives that we see in the news and all of the stuff that that go on in our society. The narratives just keep changing. Who did what and when did they do it and who knew this and blah blah blah. All the stuff. You know what I'm talking about. If the narratives keep changing, they change the facts. Our story keeps changing, but not the facts. The facts of our story are set in stone. Now that stone was rolled away. You see what I did there? You like that? Scott's going to be thinking about that all week. The facts of our story are set in stone, but the reality of our story changes daily if we will let it. If we will let it. So I want to spend, last week we talked a lot about our perspective and how the resurrection of Jesus from the dead changes our perspective so that we ought to be able to focus on Him daily because it overcomes everything set in our path and our perspective about ourselves and the life that we live, first and foremost, ought to be changing. We talked about changing our perspective and doing it daily. Because the reality is that God has not forsaken His original intention to live in intimate relationship with us on this good earth. God has not forsaken His original intent. In the beginning, God said to mankind, that you are free to live in this garden and to eat of everything on earth except for this one tree. And so we come along and we think, well, we focus on the accept part. I mean, we focus on you can eat everything except this. You see, God's original intention for us was to live in intimate relationship with Him where we, within this world, are overwhelmed with freedom. And yet that's not our experience, is it? I mean, if you think about this, you think about the world is a big place. I mean, the interesting thing about the, global politics or whatever is the reality of the difference in size. One of the things that amazes me as we go, as we listen to, world politics and economics and blah, 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 all that kind of stuff is that, we get told we ought to do things how they do it over there or whatever. And you think about, this country does it like this and this country does it like that. And then you compare the size of those things and you think, well, sure. America is giant and there's 300 million of us. Just because they do something in Finland that's got a population of like 20 million doesn't mean that's going to translate to. So size is an important reality to think about. Well, the earth is big. I mean, just the United States of America is giant. My boys took a trip a couple summers ago where they just got in my oldest son's car and put bikes on the back and just drove to the West Coast from here. You can do that when, you're in your 20s and dad's paying stuff. Scott's going to think about that all week too. He's like, yeah. When you got nothing to do and nowhere to be and somebody else is paying the bills, a trip to the West Coast is a pretty good idea, isn't it? So they took a month and they did that and they got over to California and they're bebopping around and Hayden started looking at the map and his phone and told Hyatt, if we leave now, we're driving straight for 42 hours. We need to leave. I mean, America's big, and that's not even the whole world. And God said you can eat of anything. Our relationship with God is intended to be overwhelmed with freedom. And yet Satan comes along and helps us focus on the accept. And it's that accept that I want to think about and talk about and delve into and find out what it does to us. But the first thing we need to realize is God's not forsaken his original intention. The original world was overwhelmed by freedom, and we are the ones that turned it into this prison. And now bondage is normal. Now, life is in bondage of something is normal. We all have experienced that and are experiencing bondage to something in some way or another. So how do we move on from that? See, God's plan for salvation is one that is a plan for deliverance. Ultimately, a deliverance from bondage. And we think about that as, the plan of salvation, the cross, the burial, the resurrection, it's about delivering us from sin, but it's deeper than that. You see, because our sin isn't just something we do, our sin is born out of a reality that we live within, and that reality is something that I talk a lot about, and that is, it's bathed in fear. See, sin is a byproduct of fear. And fear is something that promotes sin within our lives, that promotes other than God, that promotes lesser kingdom alliances for us. And in 1 Timothy 2, Paul tells the church, look, Jesus came and lived the life of the cross, that Jesus was crucified, was buried, and Jesus was resurrected from the dead so that everyone everywhere can experience freedom. I want to take a look briefly at a passage of Scripture, a story that we're probably all too familiar with. A story that's about deliverance, a story that's about being set free. But it's a story that's about more than just deliverance and more than just being set free. Because we think about being freed from sin. But as I said, there's something deeper there that's fueling that. And that's what I want to look at this morning. And the great thing about God's deliverance is that it's always getting started way before we ever know about it. See, God tells Moses, and we're going to look at the story. I skipped over that line. The story I want to talk about is found in Exodus chapter 1 through kind of the middle of the book. It's the story of the Exodus. If we're going to illustrate anything about how we are captivated and how we are placed in bondage and how we put that bondage on other people, it's important to look at a story that people live through and realize how we are living through that exact same thing. And that the deliverance starts way before those people ever think about it, and our deliverance starts as well. When God's calling Moses to deliver the Israelites, he says, I've heard the cries of my people. I've seen the misery and have come to deliver them. Long before the deliverance ever stops, we have to know that God is aware of that. There's someone here this morning, whether it's in person or online, somebody listening to this who needs to hear that whatever you're going through, whatever bondage or whatever prison that you're living within, whatever sin that pursues you, God is not aloof. God is aware. God is concerned. God hears your cries. And He is preparing deliverance even today. So what does that deliverance look like? And what is that deliverance from? See, God is calling us to leave where we are in the bondage that we are in to live a free life, a life of freedom that He has always wanted. But before we can break free of any bondage, before we can be delivered from any sin as prevalent or hidden, before any bondage is ever broken, we have to be released. We have to overcome what we're afraid of. We have to allow the story to change our fear. Yeah, have to keep changing. We have to change our fear. I'm so terrible at this. I apologize. The next thing I want to say is why we do what we do. And if you write anything down, write this down and think about it, meditate on it, and ask God questions and go back to this and write other stuff down that He reveals to you this week. Why do we do what we do? It's out of fear. Some way or another. It's out of fear. Whatever the sin is. I mean, you can talk to somebody who is a materialistic workaholic, somebody, and you can tell them, you need to spend more time with your family. You need to do more and break away from work and all that. And you need to stop storing up and chasing the almighty dollar and all those. And you can say that till you're blue in the face, but until you uncover what that man or woman is afraid of. You see, workaholism, materialism, it isn't just that particular sin. It is the reality or the what happens when you're afraid of not having enough. When you're afraid of not being able to provide according to the standards of those around you. It's a fear of not having enough or not being enough. You know, that person struggling with addiction, it isn't that they're just, man, I'm just hell-bent on being addicted. No, they're struggling with a fear of dealing with the storms of life or even the daily realities of life without some form of distraction or self-medication. It's a fear. It's a fear of being left alone in your own head. You find somebody that's an utter people pleaser, somebody who will defile their body with somebody else in order to be accepted because they're afraid of being alone. They're afraid of being rejected. They're afraid of not being accepted. Sin is the outworking of fear. I mean, you go all the way back to the garden. Look at the first interaction between Satan and humanity. And God's offering us this freedom. Satan plays on uncertainty. Sin happens, and what's the first negative human emotion post-sin. It's fear. So where are you? Well, we hid because we were afraid. And that wasn't the first time that they were afraid. I think you can deduce from their actions that we were afraid that what God told us wasn't true. We were afraid that we couldn't trust God like we thought we could, so we partook in this, and then that fear just compounds and multiplies. So finding out, uncovering the fear that drives us is the key to breaking the bondage of sin in our life. So the story of the Exodus starts in Genesis. It starts way back with Abraham, and God says to Abraham, I'm going to give you a son, and ultimately Abraham has Isaac, and Isaac has Jacob, and Jacob has 12 sons, and one of those sons grows up to be a leader and a very powerful person in Egypt. And so at the end of Genesis, the entire family of Jacob, known as the Israelites, move to Egypt. And then through generations and generations and generations, they multiplied. And it became a lot of people. And then there was a Pharaoh that comes along. There was a king of Egypt that comes along, and he knows nothing. And you can read all this in Exodus chapter 1. I want to kind of speed up, give you the Reader's Digest version so we can pay attention to time, in respect to time. But so a king comes along that knows nothing of Joseph, and he looks around and he sees all of these Israelites, and he says, they are becoming numerous throughout the land, and we better do something about that, because if we're ever attacked, maybe these people will join our enemies and they will defeat us. And so what Pharaoh does is he does what Satan, he leverages what Satan's been doing to us for millennial, and he leverages the what if. You see, what if causes us to need to control others. You see, the way there's two things that work out of fear: the way we treat other people and the way we treat ourselves. And so this what if, Pharaoh plays on this whole what if mentality, and so he taps into the fear of the population to control another group. Look at what happens in starting in chapter 1, verse 8. A new king who did not know about Joseph comes to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have come much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, for they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them in the forced labor, and with them to force them into labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. Circle that word in your Bible or highlight it on your phone. They came to dread the Israelites. And they worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with hard labor and brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. And their hard labor, the Egyptians used them. In all their hard labor, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose name were Shiphrah and Puah, when you help the Hebrew women in childbirth and observe them on the delivery stool, if it's a boy, kill them, but if it's a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? And the midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all of his people: every boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Man, that's pretty brutal, isn't it? I wish we could say stuff like that only went on, thousands and thousands of years ago, millennia ago. But the problem is that just like then, today, leaders and people groups are using fear to oppress and persecute others. And one of the problems that we have is that when a narrative is advanced, where one group is called on to fear another, that's how all the bad things that we do to each other come to pass in this life. I mean, that explains the Holocaust. That explains the genocide in Rwanda. It explains, most of the wars that we fight. It explains the troubled racial relationships we've had in this country since 200 some odd years ago. Fear of one causes oppression by another. And you see this. Pharaoh said, look, what if this happens? What if they do this? And so he said, if we can't, if we can't get rid of them, what we'll do is we'll just wear them out. We'll just wear them out. So he put slave masters over them, and they were working. You took overnight a population of shepherds and farmers turned into slaves and laborers. And he said, we'll just wear them out, and they won't have time or the energy to reproduce. And what happens is that they just reproduce even that much more. And he said, okay, well, if we can't wear them out, then what will we do? We'll just wipe them out. And he tells them, he calls in the midwives. He calls in Shiphrah and Puah. These two Egyptian women who were, and obviously there was more than just two midwives. This is probably the leaders of like the midwife union. And he's telling them, because there at this point there's millions of Hebrews. And so he tells them, hey, tell all the midwives working under you that when the Hebrew women are giving birth, if it's a boy, and in Josephus' account, you can read that he said, if it's a boy, just hold your hand over his nose and mouth and suffocate him so that it will appear as he was stillborn. Like, no, we're not doing that. So why aren't you? Well, we get there and the babies are already born. And so then he just takes all the pretense away. And he says, all right, then we're just going to outright murder them. Throw them into the Nile. So Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, orders the drowning of a generation of Israelites. And later on, that same Pharaoh would see God drown his entire army. So you have Pharaoh leveraging fear to oppress and persecute an entire people group. And see, if the narrative that we're hearing is pushing fear, it's usually a lesser kingdom narrative. And all the pharaohs of all the kingdoms of this world are temporary. And you know what they have to do? They have to leverage fear because of that. Because of the temporary nature of the kingdoms of this world. It's here today and it may be gone tomorrow. So fear is the motivating factor. Fear is what causes policies and procedures and oppressions and persecutions. But what we see in Scripture is that when there is an oppressed people, when there is a persecuted or marginalized, an unjustly persecuted or marginalized people, God always takes the side of the oppressed. He always takes the side of the marginalized, but the reality is that the marginalized, the oppressed, well, they have to pick a side too. Because it's not good enough for God just to say, hey, I hear the cries and I see the misery of my people, but what what God is trying to do is not come and make that situation better. He's calling us out of that. He's calling us away from what is oppressing, what is marginalizing, and what is persecuting. He's calling us out of bondage. But when we are oppressed, we pick a side too. When God led them out of Egypt, they had to leave behind. He told them, I'm calling you out of Egypt, and you must leave behind all of the idols and the graven images that you have made to defile yourself. You see, the temptation of a marginalized, oppressed group within an oppressive society is to blend in, is to compromise, is to behave in such a way as to adapt so that they do not incur the displeasure or the wrath of the oppressors. You see, because of that, because the fear of the oppressive culture or society, the oppressed typically try to accommodate the oppressors. And we're no different. We're no different. Our struggle isn't against particular sin. It's against the fear that we have to release in order to experience the deliverance that God has always intended for us. So I want us to read this. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, read this with me if you. When you help the Hebrew women in childbirth and observe them on the delivery stool, if it's a boy, kill him, but if it's a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, anybody reading with me? Read it if you got it. The midwives, however, anyone? I had a girl. That's my girl Miko. I told her I needed her here today. The midwives feared God. See, God is not calling us to a life free of fear. God is calling us to a life that the story changes our fear. We are called to change what we fear, and He is giving us examples of what we should fear, and that is to fear God. But what does that mean? What does it mean to fear God? Oh, okay. To fear God is to understand and appreciate His awesome wonder, to be cognizant of His eternal presence and power, to be aware of His holiness. You see, because if we look at Isaiah, one of my favorite examples, or my favorite prophecies, messianic prophecies, Isaiah 11:1, he says, a shoot will come from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, he's talking about Jesus, from his roots a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of power, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord. You see, you know what made Jesus so Jesus-y? Was a powerful, robust, and reckless fear of God. See, Jesus spent every day keenly aware of the power of God, about the holiness of God, about the set-apartness of God. And it made him who he was. See, the one thing that you can read the Gospels cover to cover. And I've told you this before, and I've challenged us to do this, and I think it is a marvelous exercise in discipline, but also the blessing that comes from it is beyond measure. As you know, I'm a big fan of Watchman Nee. He was a middle of last century Chinese missionary who started more than 500 churches in communist China before he was martyred in prison. And one of the things that he did as a discipline is that he read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all the way through every single day. Every single day as a discipline, he would read the Gospels all the way through. Now, and I've adopted a truncated, we talked about that word in my teen class, adopted a truncated version of that. And so I read through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, once a week. Say, I don't think, Watchmen had 6 kids and all that, but anyway. So I read through the Gospels, and I encourage you to read through the Gospels cover to cover and find a time where Jesus was anxious. Now, the Gethsemane notwithstanding, because that is there's a difference between being anguished and being anxious. Nothing scared him. He wasn't afraid of religious leaders. He wasn't afraid of political leaders. He wasn't even afraid of the demonic. Nothing could intimidate him. Because the Bible says that he delighted in the fear of the Lord. In a culture that oppresses Christ-likeness, and we can say all day long that we are one nation under God, and nobody's more patriotic than I am. Believe me, I love where we are. I love our country and all that, but let's not get it twisted. We can call ourselves one nation under God all day long, but you go live the Sermon on the Mount and see how comfortable that is in our culture and our society. You try to live Christ-like and find out why the church looks a whole lot like the rest of the world, but for this hour on Sunday mornings. Because we too are consumed with fear, and the story is calling us to change our fear. One of the things I find so amazing is that verse 15, the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose name were Shiphrah and Puah. He goes on, but what interesting names, Shiphrah and Puah. Now, I find it curious that we don't hear those names now. Nobody's named Shiphrah or Puah. But what's interesting here is that thousands of years later, thousands of years after this happened, and thousands of years after it was written down, we know the names of these 2 Egyptian women, and we don't even know the name of the Pharaoh we don't even know the name of the king of Egypt, but we know these 2 women's names because they feared God. Come on, Mika, I needed an amen on that. When that hit me this week, I was like, my sister Mika's going to love that. We don't know the name of the king of Egypt or Pharaoh, but we know these 2 midwives because they feared God. What God is calling us to, what the story will change, is what we fear. This morning, there's somebody here that needs a bigger and better fear. There's somebody that's hearing this that needs to trade in fear of not being accepted by mere mortals. And what does the Bible say? What can mere mortals do to me? There's somebody listening that needs to understand that the fear of not having enough. Remember what we read right before the sermon this morning? Don't worry about what you eat or drink. Don't be afraid that you won't have enough. God will provide. All we have to do is trade one fear for a bigger and better fear. One illustration, and then we'll be done. And I did not make it in 20 minutes. I apologize. Told Hillary, I'm really going for this. There's a man named Robert Blankenship. He lived in Delaware, Ohio. And years ago, he won the Coast Guard Medal of Valor. And how do you win the Coast Guard Medal of Valor in the middle of Ohio? Is that there was a ditch that ran through his front yard. And in the middle, and this region of Ohio was experiencing record storms and rains and flooding and all that. And he had this just drainage ditch in front of his house that was about 3.5 feet deep and about 4.5 feet wide. And it was just full of rushing water. And he was sitting at his breakfast table one morning, and the water was just rushing by, and he was just watching it. And then, to his utter disbelief and terror, he saw a little girl being washed through this ditch. A toddler had fallen up the street, had fallen into this ditch, couldn't get out, wasn't strong enough to swim, couldn't grab onto the side, and was just being rushed down this, rushed along this raging floodwaters in this drainage ditch. And what he knew was that a few blocks down the street was this culvert. And he knew if she goes down into that culvert, she's going to drown, and it's over. And he rescued her. He took off running through his front yard, and he dove into that ditch, and he swam, or did the best he could to swim toward her, and finally he reached her, and he grabbed her. He grabbed onto a rock on the side, and just about 7 yards before they both went through that culvert, he was able to pull him up and her, and he saved her, and he won the Coast Guard Medal of Valor for saving her life. But here's the remarkable part of that story. Robert Blankenship didn't know how to swim. He lived his whole life afraid of the water. But church, that morning, he was overcome by a bigger and better fear. And it moved him in such a way as to astonish all those who knew him. God's calling us to a bigger and better fear. I, for one, am tired of being afraid that I won't have enough. I, for one, am so tired of being afraid that I won't be liked, that I kill myself pleasing people. I, for one, am ready for a bigger and better fear. Can the story change what we fear? And no longer can we be a people afraid of what this world can do to us. Can we no longer be a people afraid of the economy doing this, or the political world doing that, or society this, or interest rates that, and all these things? And only thing we fear is the merciful, compassionate, graceful, true, and living God. Because when we are in awe of His grace, when we are in awe of His wonder and His power, when we are cognizant of His eternal presence and aware of His holiness, when I am keenly and powerfully aware of God, nothing can intimidate me. Nothing. You know how Jesus stood before Pilate? He feared God. He knew Pilate can do nothing to me. He feared God. God's calling us to a bigger and better fear. We will never break free of any bondage in this life until we break free of the fear that's fueling it, that's causing it. Unless we break free of the what if factor of life, until we break free of the fear of others and what they can do, we will never stop being part of the problem until we are free of the fear of being outsiders, of being looked down upon, of being ostracized or left out. until we are willing to leave other lesser kingdom idols behind and fear God, we'll never experience the life that He has in store for us. This morning, you are invited to a bigger and better fear. A fear that is keenly aware of the presence and holiness of God. A fear that can lead one through the reality of salvation and confessing that there is no power within me to be good enough or to save myself, and accept the reality of Jesus. If that's you this morning, please do that. Please let go of the need to be in control of your own destiny and give that over to the true, merciful, compassionate, graceful God of the universe. Follow Christ through His death, His burial, and resurrection in baptism. Let me check. Nope, we still have a drive. If you want to be baptized this morning, we'll find some water. We're working on our baptistry, but we'll find water. If we got to dig a hole out there and fill it with a hose, we'll find some water. Trade in your fear of a lesser kingdom for a bigger and better fear, as together we stand and as we sing.